Let me talk for a minute about the anger of Cain. And this is a relevant topic, I think, because we all have anger. And I think we all have these situations where things just don't go our way. So if I remind you of the story, reading out of Genesis, Cain, in the course of time, brought forth an offering to the Lord of his fruit, that because Cain was a farmer. Now Abel, for his part, brought forth an offering of the very best of his flock. Now the Lord had acceptance of Abel and his offering, but of Cain he did not. So Cain's composure became very downcast. His countenance dropped, it fell. And then the Lord asked Cain a question. He says, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do the right thing, will not your countenance be lifted?" And then God continues and he says, "If you do not do the right thing, be careful, because sin is crouching at the door. It wants to master you. You have to overcome it." And then from that time on, Cain goes out, he murders his brother, becomes the first murderer, and everything once again goes downhill throughout the entirety of Cain's lifetime. So we see all of Cain's life basically ruined by this one really bad decision, and it happened so quickly, and I wonder if Cain didn't even see it coming. And it's all because of anger. So I want to talk about this topic of anger. I am not an expert on the subject, I get angry, but the only answer that I want to give here is from this story. And yet, I think this story has a lot to say. I think we could start off by comparing again, because remember when I said comparing is something that we can do to, in a sense, unlock what these stories are trying to say. And I think this topic comes up all the time. What's the difference between these two offerings? And I don't want to spend too long on this, but there's two theories, and you can pick the one you believe in, because there's really not a lot of weight either way. However, one of the theories goes that because, as it says in Hebrews 11, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. So the thought there is that because Abel's sacrifice was more appropriate, his was the only one where there was shedding of blood, and the book of Hebrews talks about without shedding of blood there's no remission of sins. Where Cain's was just fruit. The other theory, or the other idea of interpretation of this, is that it does make a point to say that Abel offered the best of his, and Cain just simply offered some. And so the Lord, or God, definitely is saying something when he says you could have done the right thing and you didn't. So Cain obviously knew. He knew what the reason was. And that's really all we need to know for this discussion, because Cain has done the wrong thing. He's tried to take some kind of a shortcut. He's tried to get by easy. And it probably wouldn't have taken a whole lot for him to adjust or to do it better next time, or something like that. But I think we should not only compare the two offerings, because Cain's offering was certainly, all we need to know is that it wasn't as good. But we can compare the two people, Cain and Abel. And I think it's interesting that Abel doesn't really do anything in this story. He's this passive kind of victim. And Cain is pretty much the perpetrator, but he's pretty much the whole actor. This whole story is all about Cain. And Abel is just kind of almost like a prop. It's like Abel, we don't see much of Abel's actions here except to get killed. But it does say in Matthew, and let me see if I can find the place. It's Matthew, I believe, 18, or, okay, no, it's Matthew 23. Jesus is talking to religious people of his day, and Jesus calls Abel righteous Abel. And he says, you know, you religious people are the kind of people that have killed all the way back to the days of righteous Abel. So Jesus is making a statement here that Cain is nothing more than just a religious person. And the point I think Jesus is trying to make is that Cain was just going through the motions. He was just trying to please God kind of his own way. He was missing something, as those religious people were. So Cain is religious, and Abel is something much more than that. Abel seems to be what Jesus calls righteous. So what would you say is the difference between religious and righteous? And I think we already know a little bit about Abel because Abel was a keeper of sheep. And I think that's interesting because that's a real contrast, isn't it, between Cain, who says, am I my brother's keeper? I mean, that's a contrast, isn't it? Abel's a keeper of sheep, but Cain's like, I don't care, you know? And you know, the Bible says somewhere, the poor, the righteous people look after the poor, but unrighteous people, they don't care. And I think that's a good contrast between the two. I want to make a case in another one of these discussions that Abel was a forgiving person and Cain was not a forgiving person. Cain was a grudging person. And I think there's a difference in the character of the two. It's not just that Cain got angry, but Cain's anger was destructive. And I want to look really quickly in the book of James. And James 1 says, don't let anyone say, I am tempted by God. God does not tempt anyone. Each one is tempted when he is carried away by his own lust and desires. And lust conceives, it gives birth to sin. Sin, when it's grown up, gives birth to death. And that's what we've seen in this chapter. James also says, don't get angry for man's... be slow. He says be slow to be angry because man's anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. And here we see Cain could have been righteous like Cain could have been righteous like Abel was, but because of anger, he lost out. So, do you get angry? And the other thing I want to point out, this is a big discussion, but God asked Cain a question, and God could have done other things. He could have really come down hard on Cain and said, Cain, stop being angry, right? Does God say that? He doesn't. He says to Cain, why are you angry? And not only why are you angry, but why has your whole countenance fallen? And then he even gives him advice. He says, and he asks in the form of a question. God is very gentle. God is very gentle to us when we're angry. He says, if you do the right thing, won't your countenance be lifted? And when we look at Abel, I didn't ever think of the phrase Abel for his part, but I think that's important because Cain was the leader in the family and he did a good job. He led. He did lead. And I think that's something that's to Cain's credit. And Abel simply followed. He was just being the younger brother. The only difference is that Abel did it with the right attitude. He did it the right way. And God is saying, you know, you've got to do it the right way. It's not just that you're the leader. And if you take on that leading role, do it in humility. Do it as a learner, not just a leader. And those of us who are leaders are, I think, the most tempted to be angry when our followers are doing something wrong, but even more so when our followers are doing it better than we are. So I think all of this, I wish I had more time, but I'll finish with a verse from 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. he basically says, don't be like Cain. Don't be like Cain, who got angry at his brother, slew his brother. He had no love in his heart. Instead, be like Abel. Thank you.